Thank you for listening to the Plasma for Life podcast series brought to you by RFN Studios. If you'd like to learn more, visit www.plasmaforlife.org and follow our social media. Account links can be found on our website. I must admit, the following interview left our producer and I a bit starstruck. So I'm here with Al Roth. He's a professor of economics at Stanford, a Nobel Prize winner, and author of Who Gets What and Why. We had the opportunity to speak with Al Roth about repugnant transactions in relation to plasma.
A repugnant transaction is a transaction that some people would like to engage in, and other people think they shouldn't be allowed to, even though it may not be clear what harm is done to the other people who think they shouldn't be allowed to. There are lots of repugnant transactions. One of them obviously is paying for plasma or blood or kidneys, but they're different in different places. Paying for plasma is one of these repugnant transactions. I don't think anywhere in the world is it thought to be a bad idea to donate plasma. So it's not something we disapprove of. It's not a repugnant transaction like, say, prostitution, where by and large many of us disapprove of the transaction, not merely the payment. But on the other hand, there are lots of repugnant transactions that have laws against them that are roughly comparable. So it's not necessarily going to be easy to change the laws, and it might therefore be necessary to look for compromises with opponents.
What could that look like? A tax break or other remuneration model? Free services from the private sector to CBS? Restrictions on private companies? Contracts? Unfortunately, public policy does not always align with public opinion. Now, there was a recent study of opinion polls done by the Canadian Centre of Health Economics that shows a great majority of Canadians, actually almost 70%, actually support paying plasma donors. Why have provincial governments made it illegal despite this?
Again, that's true, I think, for lots of transactions that have bans. And it's an interesting thing that economists don't understand as well as we should. I was recently in Germany speaking about this kind of thing, and I focused on prostitution, surrogacy, and kidney exchange. And the reason I did is the laws in Germany are exactly the opposite of the laws in California for those things. In California, the only one of those three things that's illegal is prostitution. And in Germany, that's the only one that's legal, whereas surrogacy and kidney exchange are illegal. But when my colleagues and I have conducted public opinion surveys in Germany, for example, we find that large majorities of people would approve legalizing kidney exchange and surrogacies. So there, too, the laws don't reflect the current opinions, at least, of a representative population. But it's possible that laws are made by interested minorities, rather than large majorities that actually don't think about these things very often. I don't fully understand it. I would like to understand it better as an economist who studies when markets get social support and when they don't, and when bans on markets get social support and when they don't. It's a common phenomena. Some of it's inertia, some of it is ill-formed concerns. They're worried about exploiting donors, and they're not quite sure what that means, so they don't know how they would protect themselves against doing it. So I think that dialogue is an important thing. It sometimes seems as if the people who are against paid donation and who think of themselves perhaps as the advocates of potential paid donors sign an oath not to talk about the patients who need it, and the people who talk about the patients seem to sign an oath not to talk about the donors. And we should tear up those oaths, because when we talk about paid donation, we should talk both about the donors and the patients. And you shouldn't be able to talk about doing good on one side while doing harm on the other without acknowledging the potential harms and working to mitigate them. So I think that it's probably possible to protect donors, and that would also protect patients. And that's where you want to go.
I wholeheartedly agree. Patients appreciate donors and know that their health deserves equal protection. There are multiple safety standards and regulations in place to protect both donors and patients without the Voluntary Blood Donations Act. We spoke more about blood donation.
The risks and benefits have changed over time. So there's a famous book on blood by Titmus, written before it was possible to detect things like hepatitis in blood. And he argued that if you had altruistic donors, they weren't being paid, so they had no reason to give blood other than trying to do good in the world, and that if they knew that they were ill, they wouldn't give blood. Whereas if you paid, he argued, poorer people would feel the need for the money, and they might give blood even when maybe they shouldn't because they weren't feeling so well, or because they were exposed to more diseases than richer people. And of course, blood donation today involves lots of tests for all those things. So self-selection is less important there. But those, I think, were thought of as the major risks associated with paying for blood or perhaps for plasma. Of course, there's a risk on the other side, which is not having as much as you need. So plasma products, of course, provide pharmaceuticals that are very important for people, immunoglobulins and clotting factors and all sorts of things, albumin. And if you don't pay donors, you might not have as much of a supply as you need. Now, the story of Canada, of course, is it's always possible for Canadian Blood Services to buy plasma and plasma products from the United States, where plasma donation is paid.
I find it very hypocritical for us to ban paying plasma donors here. Meanwhile, we're still using paid plasma. It's just coming from American donors. And I feel like we should be trying to contribute to that global supply when we have the benefit of having such a safe blood system.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for that position, because that's right. It's apparently not the case that Canadian Blood Services believes that Canadians shouldn't get pharmaceuticals derived from plasma from donors who were paid, because a large part of the Canadian plasma supply apparently is purchased from the United States. Whether you get paid or voluntary plasma, I would think you would want to have systems in place for checking the health of the donors and the safety of the plasma that's collected. I don't think that will be very different regarding whether donors are paid or not. You want to have good regulation of the plasma collection centers. You want to make sure that the donors are not put at risk. I suppose there's some chance that if people are being paid, they might be inclined to give plasma more often than they should. My understanding is you can give plasma quite a bit more often than you can give blood because you get back the red blood cells. But there might be such a thing as too much, and so you'd want to be sure that not just that the plasma was safe, which is to say the downstream demanders of plasma would remain safe, the patients, but that the donors have to remain safe as well and healthy. So you'd want to be sure that you were regulating and monitoring that. I don't think it would put the Canadian health system in danger. It would change the source of supply of Canadian plasma, but Canadians have perfectly good plasma, is my guess. But remember, this is a repugnant transaction. Presumably the concerns of people who think that plasma shouldn't be bought are concerns that have to do with the donors, and they're somehow afraid that if we pay for plasma, we will be exploiting poor donors, and that competition might drive the price down, causing us to exploit them more. So when you're talking about changing from a ban on payment to perhaps legislation that would allow donors to be paid, it might be that a path forward is something that very robustly protects donors. So it could be that having a Canadian monopoly and regulated prices and making sure that donors, that the price isn't driven to zero, and that people who are paid to donate get a reasonable payment and appropriate health protection where they are and regular medical exams or something. It could be that would be a feasible path to move from where Canada is today to a regime in which donors were protected but were allowed to be paid, so that you would have more plasma donors.
This is the ideal scenario. Can Canada work together to get there? Can we have the best of both worlds? Can a paid and unpaid donation system peacefully coexist or even complement each other?
They probably can. Sometimes when you read the literature on this, there's the phrase crowding out comes up, that maybe if donors were paid, that would crowd out the unpaid donors. And that's an empirical question. But also, it might be that if we could pay donors, we wouldn't be harmed by crowding out of the unpaid donors. There are many things we get by paying for them. The Adam Smith has a famous paragraph saying something like, you don't get your food from the benevolence of the butcher and the baker. You buy your food. Now, of course, not everyone is able to buy food. And so when we think about the poorest among us, we have to think about, the fact that the butcher and the baker won't give them their food, we have to supply it some other way. And that's one of the things that governments are for. But we wouldn't necessarily have to worry about crowding out of altruistic donation. So I think we can have both worlds. In Iran, there is a paid monetary market for kidney donation. And I'm guessing that that has substantially reduced the amount of voluntary living donation because you can buy a well-matched kidney. Although we're going to learn a lot more about that market in the near future as some papers about it come out. So again, I don't see any problem with having paid donation and a carefully regulated market that protects all the participants on both the supply and demand side. Market designs are sets of rules to run markets, and regulations are one of among the powerful rules that help design markets. So I think that you want to care for vulnerable people in all sorts of ways. One of them is you might want to have price floors, right? You might want to make it desirable to be a plasma donor, so that you, instead of having a shortage of plasma, you might want to have a waiting list of people waiting to qualify to give plasma, for example. I don't know the exact economics of that, but I know that for kidneys, transplants are so much better for the patients and so much cheaper than dialysis that we could afford to be very generous to kidney donors in a cost neutral way, right? It wouldn't break the bank. On the contrary, it would save healthcare costs in Canada or in the US if there were more kidneys, even if we paid quite a bit to get those kidneys. So we could afford to be very generous to donors. I think that might be true as well for plasma. It makes sense to try to protect the vulnerable and make sure that the people who are donating aren't endangering their health. Of course, there's also the people who need plasma. There's also people who need kidneys. They're very vulnerable as well. And in a well-balanced society, we would take good care of them, perhaps better care than we're taking now.
We must take care of Canadians, but we should also aim to help patients around the world by contributing to the global supply, not draining it. We talked about the efficiency of the current model.
I'm not sure how efficient it is, but the fact that Canada buys plasma products from the United States suggests to me that it isn't sufficient to supply all the plasma products that Canada requires. Incidentally, there's a study out of Australia. Bob Slonim is one of the authors at University of Sydney. And what they find is that it's cheaper to buy plasma overseas, to trade internationally than it is to generate it voluntarily in Australia. And the reason is recruiting the voluntary donors is expensive, right? You have to advertise, you have to do other things. So having a voluntary system is not necessarily cheaper for Canadian Blood Services than purchasing it on the international market. That may be cheaper.
I fully agree. Right now, Canadian Blood Services, they have 3 test sites that they're opening that are just straight plasmapheresis donation centers rather than having to separate the plasma from whole blood donations. So they want to get enough funding to open 40 of these plasmapheresis centers, and they believe that it's going to possibly help them achieve 50% self-sufficiency, but I feel like that is not a very efficient investment.
Well, getting plasma from whole blood doesn't strike me as efficient. There's a need for whole blood as well. It's possible that Canadian Blood Services is collecting more whole blood than they need, but in that case, they could devote their efforts to something else. So I think that collecting plasma directly is probably more resource efficient than collecting whole blood and then fractionating it into plasma and perhaps other blood products, some of which may be wasted when you're going after plasma.
Diversity of supply is a common concern to the security of our blood supply. But here's one thing that is conveniently ignored.
When I wrote Canadian Blood Services, one of the reasons that they defend that they don't aim for self-sufficiency is because for our safety, we need to maintain diversity of supply. However, I think there's this wonderful thing called trade where even if we were 100% or more self-sufficient, we don't necessarily have to use all of our own Canadian plasma. We can trade it on the international market.
That's certainly true. Incidentally, some of the European pharmaceutical companies collect plasma in the US as well as in Europe. So there's a healthy international trade in plasma and plasma products and pharmaceuticals, derived from plasma.
We often see these stereotypes of the evil, profit-seeking paid plasma industry boogeyman versus the noble, altruistic, not-for-profit public sector such as CBS. I asked Sal if this was always the case.
No, there can be corruption in nonprofit organizations. Nonprofit organizations merely don't pay dividends to stockholders. They can pay salaries to interested parties. They can have lavish Super Bowl parties on the the public dime. So yes, every now and then we have scandals involving nonprofits in the United States, and I wouldn't be surprised if you sometimes have them in Canada.
When the CEO of a nonprofit collects a salary of over $840,000 a year, does that really make a nonprofit so much more altruistic? I can't say I'm convinced, but you make up your own mind. If you know who Al Roth is, you will associate him with his work in kidney exchange. He discussed kidney exchange, surrogacy, and the ethical philosophy around repugnant transactions.
Among the things that there's a great shortage of compared to the need are kidneys for transplantation. So you have similar proportional numbers in Canada, but I don't have them to the top of my head. So let me tell you about the United States. We have 100,000 people waiting for deceased donor kidney transplants in the United States this morning. And each year, or last year, we did, if I recall correctly, around 14,000 of those transplants. So we don't do nearly as many as we need. And people who are waiting on dialysis, which is a difficult and dangerous wait. So we have thousands of people die each year while waiting for a kidney transplant. And we also have not quite 7,000 living donors a year in the United States because kidneys are special. Healthy people have two and can remain healthy with one. So you can give a kidney to someone you love if they have kidney failure. But you can't always give a kidney to someone you love, even if you're healthy enough to give someone a kidney, because kidneys have to be well matched. And so kidney exchange, and you have it in Canada as well, kidney exchange is a system in which if I want to give a kidney to someone, but I can't because my kidney doesn't match them, and you want to give a kidney to someone, but you can't because your kidney doesn't match them, maybe I can give a kidney to your patient and you can give a kidney to my patient. And that's become a standard form of transplantation in the US and increasingly so in Canada. And I was recently in Canada talking to a transplant symposium in Banff, saying that we ought to cooperate. The two kidney exchanges ought to cooperate because sometimes it's hard for someone to find a kidney. And if you have a bigger pool of kidney donor pairs, you have a better chance of finding transplants. And Canadians and Americans could exchange with each other instead of just among ourselves. But the similarity with plasma, of course, is that a kidney can be given, but it can't be sold. You can't pay a kidney donor, nor can you pay the family of a deceased kidney donor. So in the US, our law is called the National Organ Transplant Act of 1984. I forget the name of the Canadian legislation, but everywhere in Canada, it's like plasma. You can give plasma, but you can't be paid for it. You can give a kidney, but you can't be paid for it. And in the US, while we allow plasma to be paid for, we don't allow kidneys to be paid for. Incidentally, another repugnant transaction of that sort that differs in the US and Canada is surrogacy. Surrogacy is legal both in Canada and the United States. Surrogacy is where you pay someone to bear a child for you typically based on your, a couple's sperm and egg. And in California, you can pay the surrogate. But in Canada, while surrogacy is legal and parentage is recognized of the intended parents, you can't pay the surrogate. So it's like plasma or kidney donation. You can do it, you can be a surrogate, but you can't be paid for it. So of course, there aren't very many surrogates in Canada. People come to California.
Keeping with tradition, we asked Al what he thought of the arguments of philosophers like Michael Sandel.
So I don't want to speak for Michael Sandel, but it seems to me his arguments are confused. That doesn't mean that we should make markets in everything. We should decide what we want markets to do. The kind of economist I am is I'm a market designer. I think that markets can be broken and need to be fixed in any of a variety of ways. But, the argument that people are exploiting California women who are surrogates, I think is just an ideological one. The typical California surrogate is a married mother who gets paid $50,000. So it's a regulated and very voluntary industry. I think that surrogacy is a kind of work that can be done when you have small children in your home. So I think that the people who have been California surrogates and who would like to be would feel rather abused if you propose to protect them by making it illegal to pay surrogates while still allowing surrogacy to be legal. Now, that may make sense to Michael Sandel, but I don't think there have been good arguments presented for it.
Al and I seem to have a similar goal. For Al, it's about kidneys, whereas for Peter and I, it's about plasma.
Well, if you want to think about the philosophy of this, so one of the controversial transactions I've recently been involved in is trying to expand kidney exchange across borders. And it's received some opposition in the repugnant transaction manner. But in a recent issue of The Lancet, Peter Singer, who's a famous moral philosopher, and a couple of his colleagues have written a stirring defense of it. which cheered me up. And you might be interested in it too. And, when you talk Canadian Blood Services, remind them that it would be great if their well-functioning kidney exchange and ours here in the United States shared data so that occasionally people could exchange kidneys across borders.
Canadian Blood Services, we hope you're listening. Let's invite more common sense solutions like this and make the service you provide to Canadians even better. Thank you so much to Al Roth. It was an honor to speak with you. Thank you for listening, and as always, please consider donating blood or plasma, paid or unpaid, and perhaps you may even consider donating a kidney if you're in good health. We hope you'll join us for our next episode, and for all inquiries, contact me directly at kate@plasmaforlife.org.